conducted by historians and political scientists. What makes a great president? Great presidents possess, or are possessed by, a vision of an ideal America. Their passion, as they grasp the helm, is to set the ship of state on the right course toward the port they seek. Great presidents also have a deep psychic connection with the needs, anxieties, dreams of people. "I do not believe," said Wilson, "that any man can lead who does not act under the impulse of a profound sympathy with those whom he leads, a sympathy which is insight, an insight which is of the heart rather than of the intellect." "All of our great presidents," said Franklin D. Roosevelt, "were leaders of thought at a time when certain ideas in the life of the nation had to be clarified." So Washington incarnated the idea of federal union, Jefferson and Jackson the idea of democracy, Lincoln, union and freedom, Cleveland, rugged honesty. Theodore Roosevelt and Wilson, said FDR, were both moral leaders, each in his own way and his own time, who used the presidency as a pulpit. To succeed, presidents must not only have a port to seek, but they must convince Congress and the electorate that it is a port worth seeking. Politics in a democracy is ultimately an educational process, an adventure in persuasion and consent. Every president stands in Theodore Roosevelt's bully pulpit. The greatest presidents in the scholars' rankings, Washington, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt, were leaders who confronted and overcame the Republic's greatest crises. Crisis widens presidential opportunities for bold and imaginative action, but it does not guarantee presidential greatness. The crisis of secession did not spur Buchanan, or the crisis of depression spur Hoover to creative leadership. Their inadequacies in the face of crisis allowed Lincoln and the second Roosevelt to show the difference individuals make to history. Still, even in the absence of first-order crisis, forceful and persuasive presidents, Jefferson, Jackson, Theodore Roosevelt, Ronald Reagan, are able to impose their own priorities on the country. The diverse drama of the presidency offers a fascinating set of tales. Biographies of American presidents constitute a chronicle of wisdom and folly, nobility and pettiness, courage and cunning, forthrightness and deceit, quarrel and consensus. The turmoil perennially swirling around the White House illuminates the heart of the American democracy. It is the aim of the American President series to present the grand panorama of our chief executives in volumes compact enough for the busy reader, lucid enough for the student, authoritative enough for the scholar. Each volume offers a distillation of character and career. I hope that these lives will give readers some understanding of the pitfalls and potentialities of the presidency, and also of the responsibilities of citizenship. Truman's famous sign, "The buck stops here," tells only half the story. Citizens cannot escape the ultimate responsibility. It is in the voting booth, not on the presidential desk, that the buck finally stops. Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was the 32nd President of the United States, and the only one to be elected more than twice. In any rating of presidents, there can be no more than 3 of his predecessors who could be placed in contention with him, and of his successors, there are so far none. Although of a provenance grander in the social scale than any of the others except perhaps for George Washington and his own kinsman Theodore Roosevelt, he did not coast to the White House, and soon after he got there, aroused unprecedented upper-class hostility. Known as Feather Duster by some of his early contemporaries, he was originally regarded as a lightweight, and his life contained several setbacks and one apparent catastrophe. He was more tested in peace and war than any president other than Lincoln. Although often seen as a patrician among professional politicians, he was perhaps the most skilled politician of the lot. He was even more than that. He was a blazer of trails. He aroused great loyalty, and he dazzled those around him with personal charm. Yet, by the end of his not very long life, several of those who had most helped his rise had moved not only to detachment, but to full opposition. He was therefore a man as full of ambiguity as he was of power and interest. He was a hero who had many unheroic characteristics. He was almost the opposite of the tribute that Winston Churchill paid to his friend Lord Birkenhead. "In any affair, public or personal," Churchill wrote, "if he was with you on the Monday, you would find him the same on the Wednesday, and on the Friday, when things looked blue, he would still be marching forwards with strong reinforcements." If Roosevelt was pressing an associate to undertake some controversial assignment on a Monday, it was only too likely that by the Wednesday he would have decided to split the job or to give it to somebody else instead, and that by the Friday, if things looked blue, he would have moved toward abandoning the project altogether, or at any rate for the time being. Yet he was a man of massive achievement. Equally paradoxically, while he was thought of as a leader with a program, the New Deal has remained resonant in history for over 70 years, he was much more of an improviser than an ideologue. He nudged his way forward. If something did not work, he was always willing to try something else. After 3 election victories and nearly 9 highly controversial years in the White House, he became engaged in the winning of the biggest war in American history. 1941 to 45 saw an incomparable mobilization of American effort, industrial and military. In Europe, by 1945, the U.S. Army dwarfed the British by 3-1, and in the Pacific the preponderance was many times greater. But above all, it was the massive outpouring of American industrial strength, converted to guns and tanks, aircraft and ships, which became the 8th wonder of the world, and after the relatively short period of 3.5 years, made victory inevitable over the formidable military machines of Germany and Japan. Roosevelt, who had been so excoriated by business leaders for much of his first and second terms, was able in his third term to preside over this spectacular achievement. Another of Roosevelt's paradoxes was that although a New Yorker of Dutch family origin and a Hudson Valley squire, in other words, a product not of the heartland but of the extreme eastern edge and most Europe-oriented part of America, he was peculiarly successful at transcending geography and uniting the continent. His strongest support was never on the eastern seaboard. In his landslide victory of 1936, the only 2 states that stood against the Republican debacle were Vermont and Maine. And in 1944, it was the late declaring western states that contradicted the equivocation of the early eastern results. Roosevelt was also an outstanding example of a leader who, although not in any full sense an intellectual, had an unusual capacity to inspire the intellectual classes. It is impossible to understand Franklin Roosevelt without appreciating the influence that his remote cousin Theodore had upon the first 38 years of his life. Both Theodore and Franklin, who were 5th cousins, were 8th-generation Americans, being equally descended from Klaus Martensen von Rosenvelt, who had arrived in New Amsterdam from Haarlem in Holland about 20 years before the change of name to New York in 1664. The 2 presidents were equally descended from his son, Nicholas, American-born in 1658. Thereafter the 2 families split, the elder of Nicholas's 2 sons founding what became known as the Oyster Bay or Long Island branch of the family, into which, almost 200 years later, Theodore was to be born, and the younger producing the Hyde Park, Hudson Valley branch, which added Franklin 23 years after that. The position was complicated by Franklin marrying in 1905 a daughter of the dead younger brother of Theodore, who was then in the White House, but who nonetheless came to New York and gave a presidential blessing to the wedding. What is indisputable is that both Roosevelt presidents came of impeccable New York stock, with many generations of prosperity behind them. Insofar as there is an American aristocracy, both Roosevelts clearly belong to it. Indeed, the middle stretch of the Hudson Valley, particularly the eastern bank, was laid out in a series of grand squirearchical estates unmatched by any concentration in England or France. They made the properties in the so-called dukeries of northwest Nottinghamshire look sporadic. And there the riparian squires lived a pattern of life that was not ostentatious, but determinedly gentlemanly. James Roosevelt, FDR's father, was well described as a tall man with mutton chops and whiskers who was rarely without a riding crop. He bred trotters and built a famous herd of Alderneys that he crossed with Jerseys and Guernseys. He took the cure annually at a German spa, hunted in Poe, shot grouse in Scotland, and as a patriarch was amongst those who decided who belonged to New York society. He and those like him were in New York City for the relatively short late fall season, but in general they preferred to spend most of the year in their river residences, perhaps going to the city a day or so a week in order to look after their substantial inherited portfolios. The Oyster Bay Roosevelts were Long Island Sound rather than Hudson River grandees, but they added to the vast cousinage, which was a very self-conscious link not only between the two Roosevelt branches, but also with many of the other old New York families. They used the terms Cousin X and Cousin Y in a way that similar English families, Cavendishes and Spencers, Cecils and Stanleys, would not have thought of doing. When the very unpretentious Eleanor Roosevelt became engaged to FDR in 1903 and had to write to her formidable mother-in-law-to-be, Sarah Roosevelt, she always and probably addressed her as Cousin Sally. Somewhere along the way, the two branches of the family had become separated in their politics. The Oyster Bay branch had been Republicans at least since the Civil War. Their republicanism was an affiliation that fitted naturally with their late 19th century social milieu. The Hyde Park Roosevelts had become loosely Democratic. FDR's father was a supporter of Grover Cleveland, a New Yorker who was himself fairly right-wing and was the only man to have two separate terms as president. James Roosevelt was a Democrat because his father had been one, and he liked established habits. It was in several ways paradoxical that the Hyde Park Roosevelts should have been more unorthodox in their politics than the Oyster Bay ones. Immured in the countryside on their Hudson River bluff, 80 miles upriver, although they were never without a Manhattan residence for occasional use, they were much more detached from the largely Democratic city than were their cousins on the much nearer part of Long Island. It pointed more to the absence of any rigid ideological position in American party politics at the time than to any virulence of socio-economic dispute between the two branches. Franklin Roosevelt's relations with his distant kinsman and uncle-in-law, as he was to become, epitomized this. The two Roosevelts were influenced by much the same impulses. Moreover, Franklin Roosevelt in his early days was imbued with an envy of the life of Oyster Bay, more pulsating than that of Hyde Park. At Oyster Bay, or Sagamore Hill as the house was called, there was almost excessive boisterousness. By 1898, TR had 6 children, varying in age between 14 and 1, and all of them, when the patriarch was at home, were pushed into a relentless regime of athletic exercise and maybe fun. They were also first cousins and nephews and nieces, including Eleanor, born in 1884, intermittently present. The life of Franklin at Springwood, the name of the estate at Hyde Park, was by contrast solitary to the point of loneliness. At his birth on January 30th, 1882, his father was 53, his only sibling, a half-brother known as Rosie Roosevelt, was 27 and far away. His mother, born Sarah Delano, who claimed an even grander lineage than the Roosevelts, was a commanding, ever-present, and devoted matriarch who retained this position until 1941, in the 9th year of Franklin Roosevelt's presidency. Although she was one of 9 children, her share of her father's legacy was more than $1 million 19th century dollars. That father was Warren Delano. But Sarah could not provide much in the way of adolescent friendship. When, therefore, Franklin was invited to spend a July 4th at Sagamore Hill, he was determined to accept, in spite of mild opposition from his parents, and when he got there, he found the enthusiastic gregariousness intoxicating. Apart from the fact that TR never went to school but was privately tutored until he went to Harvard in 1876, the two Roosevelts' lives pursued a remarkably parallel course, at an interval of 23 years. And Franklin did not attend school until at the age of 15 he was sent to Groton, the would-be copy of Eton established in northern Massachusetts a dozen years before. Neither Roosevelt achieved academic distinction, although TR absorbed more historical method and knowledge. He was also more sociably successful, being easily elected to the most fashionable Harvard club, Porcellian, whereas Franklin had to make do with the Fly Club, among the second rank of such bodies. The habits of Porcellian members, always subsequently wearing little pigs as pendants on their watch chains and caballing together even at the most inappropriate occasions, makes one feel that Franklin may have been lucky to be rejected. And he achieved what might be regarded as the more interesting undergraduate distinction by becoming president, in effect editor, of the Crimson, the Harvard undergraduate newspaper. Both fathers died during their sons' first years at Harvard. Theodore experienced more grief, although maybe Franklin suffered more inconvenience, for the early widowhood of Sarah Roosevelt led her to take lodgings in Boston in order to keep a closely maternal eye upon her only son. However, it is